Okay, happy day, everyone. Welcome to Pacific Historic Parks History Talk Series. My name is Jacqueline Balahaja, and I will be the host for today's History Talks. Pacific Historic Parks is the leading organization supporting significant historical sites in the Pacific for future generations. We are a nonprofit cooperating association that provides support to 4 national parks and 1 state park. These parks are Pearl Harbor National Memorial, Kalaupapa National Historical Park, and Diamond Head State Monument in Hawaii, American Memorial Park in Saipan, and Warren the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam. The mission of Pacific Historic Parks is to support the USS Arizona Memorial and other Pacific historic locations through education, through interpretive programs, research, preservation, and restoration to perpetuate the memory of events and to honor the people that are involved in these sites. The History Talk series is made possible with funding provided to Pacific Historic Parks from Humanities Guam and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Federal ARP Act of 2021. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items for today's presentation. First, we ask that you remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, you may utilize the chat feature. You may type your questions in the chat box, and any questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Finally, this History Talks presentation will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our social media channels for you to share or rewatch at a later time. Our guest speaker for today is Father Eric Forbes. He is a Capuchin friar and a Catholic priest on Guam, born and raised on the island. He obtained a BA in history from San Francisco State University in 1984 and a Master's of Divinity degree from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California in 1990. As a priest, he has served in parishes on Guam and Saipan and taught in various Catholic schools. His lifelong interest in the Chamorro history has led him to do archival research in the United States, in the Philippines, Spain, Germany, and in Italy. He produced a DVD documentary titled I Am Chamorro and has written half a dozen books and many more magazine articles on various Marianas history topics. He maintains a Chamorro culture and a Marianas history blog for which he has already reached nearly 2 million hits. He currently is a board member for the Guam Preservation Trust. So without further ado, I welcome Father Eric Forbes as he presents Chasing the Enemy, the Guam Combat Patrol.
A warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And today we're going to look at the story of the Guam Combat Patrol. This patrol was in existence from November 1944. So World War II was still going on until about 1948. And it was formed to eliminate the danger to both American military and Chamorro civilian alike, the danger of Japanese stragglers. And what do we mean by to eliminate that danger? To eliminate by way of arresting them, the Japanese straggler, or by death if they refuse to surrender. And so here in this slide, we can see 14 of the members of the Guam Combat Patrol, all well armed and crouching in the jungle, waiting to move in and look for stragglers. So I don't know about you, but if I were a straggler, I would probably surrender to this group. So the Guam Combat Patrol was one way that Chamorros were active in their own liberation. There were other ways that the Chamorros did participate in their own liberation. For example, in Atati, some Maritso men rose up against the Japanese guards and overcame them and killed some of them. We also remember that some of the Maritso men went out in their canoes to meet the American ships and got on board and supplied information. And when American forces were on the ground, on island, many Chamorros came forth with whatever information they knew. So there were various ways that Chamorros were participants in their own liberation, but the Guam Combat Patrol was certainly a very important one. And in one Liberation Day ad in the 1960s, someone congratulated the American military for what they did to win the island back from the Japanese. But the person who put the ad also mentioned that the Guam Combat Patrol were the liberators of Guam and the ones who made Liberation Day meaningful. So organized Japanese resistance, meaning to say soldiers under the command of a Japanese officer giving direct commands that were followed, that more or less ceased on August 10th, 1944. By then, the Americans were all the way up to the very north of Guam. They had already secured Barragata Heights, known as Mount Barragata in those days. They had already secured Mount Santa Rosa. By August 10th, they were already looking over the cliffs in Hinapsan and Litekzan or Ritidian. So the island was more or less secured by that date. However, there were upwards of anywhere between 5,000 to 7,000, because they could only estimate, they could only guess, 5,000 to 7,000 Japanese soldiers that had fled, no longer fighting in battle, but had fled into the thick woods, especially in northern Guam. And I know so much of northern Guam is all built up now, but in those days it was all woods and some fields for cattle grazing. But if you've ever gone into those woods in the north, some people do go in there to look for moss or lumut. You know just how thick and unwelcoming the northern forests of Guam are. And with the caves and the ravines that can be found there, several thousand people could successfully hide, at least for a time, in the north. So you can see there in the headline which was from a newspaper printed on August 10, 1944, Guam was under US control and the conquest of the island was completed. The Americans were all the way to the tip of the northern part of the island, but the troops were still liquidating trapped Japanese. So what complicated the capture of these Japanese who fled into the jungle was their attitude of never surrender. It was a dishonorable act, according to their philosophy, their code of conduct, to surrender. They would rather die and hopefully kill the enemy in the process of you yourself dying, rather than surrender and they have a living Japanese captive in their power. So the Americans well knew, because Guam was not the first place that they took from the Japanese. They had already seen a lot of battle in the South Pacific, Guadalcanal, and many other places. They knew what the Japanese were capable of. They could feign surrender and come out to meet the Americans, but have a grenade with them and let that grenade explode and blow themselves up, but take you with them. And many were the testimony of Americans and even the Guam Combat Patrol, that some of the Japanese they captured would continue to bite, kick, punch. They would try to grab your knife or even pick up a rock. So you had to be, and bash your head. So you had to be really cautious, even with the Japanese soldiers who appeared to surrender. And so we have there the front cover of a book written by Hiro Onoda, who was a Japanese soldier who hid in the Philippine jungles until 1974. And we know, of course, Yokoi here on Guam up till 1972. So the story of Onoda is that he was, his presence in the jungle was well known by the people who lived there. And of course, that information seeped out to others. So a Japanese investigator went out to actually meet Onoda in the jungles of his little island in the Philippines. And Onoda explained to him, this is 1974, Onoda explained to this Japanese investigator, "I will never surrender to the Americans." And the Americans were even gone from the Philippines long before that, 30 years before that. But Onoda did say that he would surrender to a Japanese commander, because then he's just following orders. He's not surrendering to the enemy. So they found Onoda's last commanding officer, who was a bookseller now in Japan, and got him to get on a plane and come down to the Philippines. And Onoda met with his former commander, and the former commander said, "By order of the Japanese Imperial Command, you know, such and such battalion or army group, whatever, has ceased operations, and all soldiers are to lay down arms and report to their nearest commanding officer." So Onoda surrendered technically to his own army, to his own commander, and not to the enemy. So this was the attitude of the Japanese that the Guam Combat Patrol were looking for, and the American military. So they knew that this was not an easy task to accomplish. So although the battle was won, not all was calm on the island of Guam, even after formal Japanese surrender. They were still, as the headline says, liquidating ragged Japanese remnants who many times could act as snipers. So at the bottom right side of the screen, you can see the story there of a colonel who was the son of a major general who was shot and killed by a Japanese sniper here on Guam. So this was one of the dangers that the Japanese stragglers posed for many years in the jungles of Guam. Even into 1945, snipers on Guam were a problem, even at Nimitz's headquarters up in Nimitz Hill, or Libugon, the Chamorro name for the place. Even after the war was over, so the Japanese surrendered on August 15, and the war was, technically over by then. The headlines were that Tokyo, once the Americans entered Tokyo, which was in late August, I believe August 28th of 1945, the Americans entered Tokyo. So now the Americans were able to police and keep Tokyo secure. The headline was that Tokyo was a safer place than Guam, because the Guam police were still hunting down Japanese who were prowling the jungle and shooting. And these are headlines from the newspapers of the day, so you'll have to excuse the offensive nicknames for nationalities used at the time. So much a problem were these Japanese stragglers and snipers that it didn't even take the military to organize the Guam Combat Patrol for Chamorros to do something about it. Some individual Chamorros just took their own initiative to deal with these Japanese hideaways. So one was LUISA BAZA from Maritza, who married SANTOS. So that's a picture of her with her pistol at her waist and her husband next to her. And she had a reason to go out looking for Japanese runaways, because she had lost family members in the Tinta massacre, when the Japanese put some Chamorro civilians in a cave in Tinta and threw grenades in and blew them up, and many of them died. Not all, but many of them died, and some of them were from Luisa's family. So she was only too happy to go out and capture Japanese stragglers and bring them to justice. So the Americans called her the Guam Pistol Packin' Mama. And as the note there says in the headlines, it was to avenge the massacre of those Chamorros in Tinta. So the American military ordered the Guam chief of police at the time, who was a Navy Reserve lieutenant commander by the name of John Wigg. So he was head of the Guam police. He was tasked with organizing some kind of local patrol to hunt for Japanese stragglers. So this was done on November 4, 1944 by Lieutenant Commander John Wigg, and it had to be okayed, which it was, by the military governor of Guam at the time, General Henry Larson, who's pictured there in the picture on the left, shaking hands with Judge Manabusan, and then after him, Monsignor Calvo, and after him, Simon Sanchez, and after him, I don't remember, sorry to say. But these were Guam civil leaders thanking General Larson and the Americans for liberating them from Japanese occupation. So in a 1980 interview, John Wigg explained why US soldiers alone couldn't do it, why a Chamorro Guam Combat Patrol was needed. And I quote, "After Guam was captured, a force manned by Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force started from the south of Guam to sweep the island of stragglers. There were caves and jungles they didn't even know about. So when it was over, they only got 2 stragglers. The Chamorro Patrol knew the obvious hiding. They knew where the stragglers would go, as if they were doing the same thing. As if the Chamorro patrolman said, well, where would I hide? Well, that's where the Japanese would hide. So knowledge of the terrain, caves, trails, streams, because obviously people need water in the jungle. So all of these things were known to the Chamorro patrolmen. So to form the Guam Combat Patrol, John Wigg called for volunteers from the regular police force. So these were already men who were inclined to do this kind of work and who were already trained in some way for this kind of work. You'll see a picture of a group of 14 of combat patrolmen. Okay, and now we go to the next slide to look at the names. So we have the names of the first 15. So the first formation of the Guam Combat Patrol consisted of 15 patrolmen. In time, this gradually increased to about 40. And you can see the names there. And who knows, maybe a viewer or two might recognize the name or maybe even identify a grandfather or father in it. And at the very top of that list is the leader, who was Juan UNPINGCO from the familiar Sauru. And he was born in 1904. And I put that asterisk there because in some of the documents, they're not too sure about his age or his year of birth, but we have the birth record. And he was born in 1904. And at the age of 17 in 1921, he joined the Guam militia. And then in 1930, he joined the Guam police. And in 1936, he left that to do his own work, private work, business. And then right after the Americans returned to Guam, he returned to the Guam police. So he was already a Guam policeman when the Guam Combat Patrol was formed in November of 1944, and he was selected to be the leader. These patrolmen were trained by the Marines, and not only trained, but also armed, supplied by the Marines. Well, it was a military government. There was no civilian government on Guam until the Department of Interior took over in 1949. But although the Marines equipped them and trained them, the Guam Patrol had their own assets, had their own wits, had their own skills that only the locals could supply. So for example, because the Chamorro language united everybody, they could find out from the local people, some of whom may not have been able to express themselves in English, about recent sightings, either of actual Japanese soldiers. Someone might catch a glimpse of a passing soldier in the jungle, or evidence that they left behind, or even things that go missing when someone who has no neighbors out in their ranch, so they don't necessarily suspect a fellow Chamorro of stealing something from the ranch. It could possibly be the work of these Japanese stragglers. So you'll see in that first picture on the left, a local rancher explaining to the Guam Combat Patrol reports of missing items at the ranch. The Guam Combat Patrol also had to have tremendous powers of observation. So this was their own skill. They had to notice everything in the jungle. A broken brush that didn't suggest a passing wild pig. Maybe it was too high of a break in a branch. Even banana peels. So a Japanese straggler picks a banana and throws the peel away. They'd notice that. Perhaps when a straggler was passing by, perhaps a rough branch poked something and left a strand of thread or some other fabric on the branch. So these combat patrolmen share their experience of going into the jungle and noticing all of these things. The Japanese stragglers had to match the wit of the Chamorro Combat Patrol with their own skills and trickery and talents. So they learned not to leave banana peels around or to take too many bananas off the tree because that would be noticed. Or when they took the banana off, not to leave the evidence that it had been picked because you can see the break. Of course, when Mother Nature calls, you have to do your business, but they learn to bury their feces in the jungle or to go to the bathroom in the ocean if they could do that. They learn to cover their tracks. They learn many things to notice themselves, just as the Chamorros had to be very observant. They also had to be on top of their game and not leave any signs behind. But, we're only human. We can't be, we can't get it right 100% of the time. And all you need is that one time to be wrong to be caught. So in the next slide, you can see something that the Japanese, one of their tricks was to string along empty cans between bushes. And that became their alarm system because a Guam patrolman or an American soldier is walking along and doesn't realize that there's a string of empty cans, and he doesn't even have to touch the can, he just touches the bush that's tied in some way to this alarm system, and the cans go rattling and the Japanese are alerted and run away and escape trouble. But there's always two sides to every coin, and the other side of the coin of this system is now the combat patrol or the American military knew that there were Japanese in that area. So the Guam Combat Patrol scoured the island. The Americans said that from Ritidian or Litekzan up in the north all the way down to Cocos Island, there was not a cave, not a ravine, not a crevice, not a stream, not a hill that wasn't explored by the Guam Combat Patrol, and not just during the day, 24 hours a day. As one patrolman said in an interview many years later, it was at night that the Japanese came out because the Japanese figured, well, everybody else is asleep. Nighttime is when we go and we look for the things we need. So the Guam Combat Patrol also took shifts so that 24 hours there were some patrolmen looking for the stragglers 24 hours a day. And because they knew that the Japanese would like to come out at night, they set up traps or ambushes at night. So say, for example, that the military had dumped some, supplies they didn't need anymore, excess or surplus supplies, and they didn't need or use supplies, and they just dumped it somewhere for the time being. They knew that the Japanese would raid that dump pile that night. So the Guam Combat Patrol would hide on the perimeter of that open field where the dump was, and start, shooting when the Japanese stragglers came out. So they usually buried their dead right on the spot wherever the action was. But one patrolman said in an interview that one time they shot a Japanese straggler and killed him in a very rocky part of the island. And you can see the picture on the right. of a patrolman coming out of a little cave by the side of a hill. And it's just pure rock, and it's very hard to find any soft soil deep enough to bury a body. So what did they do? They put the body in one of those crevices and blew it up. So at least the falling rock would cover the deceased's body. He would be buried by rock, essentially, rather than in the soil. Just how successful was the Guam Combat Patrol in eliminating this danger from Japanese stragglers? Well, we do have something of a tally. When you read reports, when you read interviews, the number is never consistent. The lowest is 117, and the highest estimate is around 200, and this is killed. So between 117 and 200 Japanese stragglers killed by the Guam Combat Patrol. And you'll see on the right there a picture, and I believe that's Felix Wustig at the bottom, a tally. Down Felix's fingers are pointing at about 130 some, and I believe that would be killed. And there's space for more. So yeah, the 117 lowest number I've seen seems to have been surpassed by this point already. And you can see that the slogan at the bottom is setting the rising sun. So it suggests that the Guam Combat Patrol were definitely putting an end to what had been the pride of the Japanese in conquering practically all of the Pacific and so much of Asia. They were putting that sun to rest. They killed so many Japanese stragglers that the Americans began to ask, where are your captures? Why aren't we seeing live bodies being taken down to the stockade in Agagna Heights, where the prisoners of war were kept? As you can see, the total number of Japanese stragglers taken alive was just 16. So the Americans started to wonder what was going on. Why were the combat patrol killing much more than taking alive? Was something up? The Americans sent, I believe it was Adolfo Scambaluri, who was a Chamorro policeman, to accompany the Guam Combat Patrol a day or two, whatever it was, and to let the Americans know what was up. And let's just say that the Americans never formally accused or even wondered out loud, were the Guam Combat Patrol simply killing, surrendering Japanese? The accusation was never made, and definitely formal charges were never pressed against anyone in the Guam Combat Patrol for what would be essentially murder, to kill a Japanese soldier who comes out unarmed with his hands up. And by the way, because of the dangers of Japanese soldiers feigning surrender, the surrendering Japanese was often made to strip completely naked. And that way, all suspicion of hidden grenades or whatnot could be eliminated. But as Scambaluri and the Americans themselves, when deciding that nothing criminal was going on the part of the Guam Combat Patrol, realized that the Combat Patrol knew just how dangerous these stragglers were and how unwilling they were to surrender. The Japanese had every opportunity on their own, without the Combat Patrol or the American military being anywhere near them, to simply come out of the jungle and be found by civilians or perhaps a passing military truck, to be found arms up on a road and be taken safely into custody. The Japanese had every opportunity to do that, and many did. Many actually did, and they were safe and sound. So the Japanese soldiers that the Combat Patrol were hunting were not of that ilk. They were unwilling to surrender and willing to fight back. And so the Guam Combat Patrol simply shot until a Japanese soldier came out with hands up and surrendered. We have to allow for the possibility that there was a little bit of vengeance going on. As I said, there's nothing to suggest vengeance that reached a criminal level on the part of the Guam Combat Patrol, meaning murder, but definitely a sense of justice, a sense of vengeance, and perhaps some satisfaction that they were righting the wrongs of 2.5 years of Japanese occupation. One combat patrolman was alleged to have said, these Japanese soldiers wanted to die for the emperor, and we were willing to give them that opportunity. But the Guam Combat Patrol also faced the risk of being wounded or dying, and 2 did die. 2 were shot by the Japanese stragglers. So Antonio P. Manibusan and Pedro R. San Nicolas lost their lives. And there were at least 4 wounded: Vicente Borja, George Flores, Joaquin Ugan, and Juan Lujan. And there's a picture in the middle there with a wound to his left hand is George Flores. I don't remember, so I won't even mention my suspicion, but who the other 2 are, but I do know for sure that's George Flores in the middle. And definitely a guy who seems wounded on the left elbow or arm, and perhaps somewhere else. So there is the story, very interesting story about the incident at Motsum, because this incident is well described by several sources. It was, and it serves as a great example of the kind of fighting that the Guam Combat Patrol faced or engaged in when looking for these Japanese stragglers. So what happened was there was a report by ranchers in the area of missing cattle. And so the Guam Combat Patrol went up to Motsum, which you can see there is on the eastern coast of Guam, north of UOG, north of Fadian. Perez Brothers used to have a quarry in Fadian. I'm not sure they still do. But just to orientate yourself where Motsum is, it's the present site of a golf course. So back road to Anderson. So there was, I guess, a cattle rancher up there who was complaining of missing cattle, and the Guam Combat Patrol went up to check things out. And they discovered 4 Japanese hideouts. By that, I mean rough shacks or something similar where the Japanese were hiding. They spotted a Japanese lookout hiding in the tree up at the top where he could look and warn his compatriots of oncoming Americans or Chamorro Combat Patrol. They shot and killed him. Down he went. And then they cleared out the first 3 hideouts. When they got to the 4th hideout, there were 25 Japanese huddled in there. And they also posed a threat. They were not going to surrender. So the Guam Combat Patrol opened fire. Well, that sent the 25 soldiers, those who weren't instantly killed, scattering. And 5 were shot and killed by the Guam Combat Patrol. 8 fled into the jungle, but that leaves 12 who, next slide, threw themselves over the cliff. So you can see that resolve of the typical average Japanese soldier, never to surrender. Die, and if you can kill at the same time, even better. When the Americans went into that 4th shack or hideout, they found 300 local melons. You can be sure those weren't gifts of Chamorro melon farmers. So the ability of the Japanese straggler to go out at night and steal 300 melons shows you just how capable they were. The Americans also, the Guam Combat Patrol also found in that fourth shack things that the Japanese could only have stolen from American military supply: butter, cheese, milk, rice, and canned goods. By 1947, 1948, the Japanese stragglers had already spent 3 years in the jungle. And you can imagine the effect living in the wild like that, with our humidity, with the rain, the critters out there, the mosquitoes and whatever you have. We didn't have snakes yet. We were just about to have snakes right after the war. But life was rough out there, and it took a toll physically, mentally, even on many of the Japanese stragglers, that one combat patrolman said he started to feel sorry for the Japanese stragglers. That he said that they were more like beggars, unshaven, long hair, their clothing tattered or mildewed. And because their clothing would disintegrate, they'd have to go and steal clothing. And sometimes you grabbed a shirt off of clothes line, and the shirt was too big for you, but you wore it anyway. So, you know, when some of the Japanese would come out, they'd look like this, and they would look more like beggars, and some of the patrolmen felt sorry for them. Sometimes even when the Japanese didn't want to surrender and tried to fight back, their guns jammed, their grenades were dead, didn't explode. And just think also, living out there in the jungle with minimal clothing, you scrape yourself, you hurt yourself somehow, and there's no first aid. So infections, wounds, things like that. These guys by 1947, 1948 were in bad shape. And so they began to give up, or perhaps they disappeared, meaning to say they died a natural death, or perhaps suicide, and were never killed by the combat patrol or the Americans, and were never captured. And in a 1974 interview, next slide, please, George Flores, who was a Guam Combat Patrolman whose picture was, or whose presence was in one of those pictures in the hospital, visiting one of the wounded men, George, he described his motive. Now, of course, he's talking 1974. And we all know that our perspective changes over time, even slightly. So this is how he felt in 1974. Sure, the Japanese, treated us like animals. They beat you if you didn't follow their orders. But I joined the patrol, not because I hated the Japanese, but because I wanted to work with the Marines and help them defend our island and our lives. So when we're speaking about the motives of these Guam Combat Patrolmen, well, there's upwards of 40 of them, so you're going to have different motives among different people. And sometimes the motive that made you join a group is not the same motive that kept you in the group to the end. Motives change. The last Japanese killed by the Guam Combat Patrol was on Christmas Day in 1948. They had been alerted by local people down there of a possible straggler sighting in Talafofo. So they went to the area and they caught 2 Japanese butchering a cow. They opened fire, one was killed, and the other got away. After that, the sightings of Japanese stragglers grew thinner and thinner. The Guam Combat Patrol was phased out. Most of them were all Guam policemen, so they just became regular policemen. But the legacy remained. In 1955, a Japanese straggler went into the house of Josefina Martinez in Sinahanya as she was frying bananas, madoza. And he kicked the door open and she was alone in the house, and scared her and stole bananas and ran away. Didn't touch her, didn't hurt her, thank God. But when the police found out about it, they sent AGUON and another Guam patrolman, Bob Bukikosa, to go look for the stragglers. This is 1955. This is 10 years after the end of World War II, but Guam patrolmen were still being tasked to look for the odd straggler who popped up every once in a blue moon in the 50s and 60s. In May of 1960, 2 stragglers were caught in Toksa, and AGUON was interviewed about it, and he said, of course, there's stragglers still out there. He knew that many of the Japanese who were stationed in Oroti, where they were trying to build an airfield, and those who were in Asen, didn't make it to the north of Guam to join the bulk of the Japanese forces moving north. They were cut off, so they went south and fled into the jungle. And AGUON knew that these Japanese were proud, that they would never surrender, that they were good at surviving in the jungle. And he said, of course, there's stragglers out there. And he was right, because as we mentioned, Shoichi Yokoi in 1972 was discovered again in Talafoco. Something ironic happened in 1962. A Japanese lieutenant colonel by the name of HIYAKITA came to Guam with a group of Japanese to look at World War II sites. And AGUON was in the room and noticed his face. And I said, I captured you in 1945. And sure enough, AGUON and HIYAKITA met 17 years after HIYAKITA's surrender. Were the Guam Combat Patrol ever recognized? They were. The original members were given bronze stars, and AGUON was given a silver star. I'm having to kind of rush this up because we're running out of time. They were featured, next slide, in Liberation Day parades. AGUON was the Grand Marshal for 1 year. In 1969, a law was passed giving the Guam Combat Patrolmen a bonus. And funding came later in 1970, and there's Governor Camacho and Lieutenant Governor Kurt Moylan giving, I believe, one of the Wustigs his check, his bonus, 26 years after the fact. And there have been all kinds of other benefits that have been given to them over the years. In 1994, Governor Joe Atta, he was governor at the time, they put up this Guam Combat Patrol Memorial in Adelup, whose marker explains that it is also to honor the U.S. Marines, but also the Guam Combat Patrol and Scouts who helped the Marines. And so next slide, we say Sidzus Masi. We say Sidzus Masi to the Guam Combat Patrol, but also to you for listening to this presentation. Sidzus Masi, thank you.
Thank you, Father Eric, for your wonderful presentation. Our team is monitoring the chat box, and we will now open up the floor for questions. Our first question that we have here is, were the 2 combat patrol men that died in service buried at a veteran cemetery, and how long did these men serve?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had the answer. I could easily give you the answer because I can do the research and find the answer. So if you don't mind giving someone on the staff your email and the question again, I'll email you the answer.
Sounds great. Thank you. The next question is, when did the Guam Combat Patrol officially disband?
That's another good question, and we don't really have a firm answer. The last straggler killed was 1948. And after that, we don't hear anything about them. So we can just basically say by the end of 1948, they quietly disbanded.
Okay. And the final question that I have here was about Guam's pistol packing mama, LUISA BAZA SANTOS. How interesting that she had a gun and served almost as like vigilante. Is there any information that you can provide about her or what happened to her? Obviously, the Guam Combat Patrol didn't get tried for anything or they weren't arrested for any deaths. Is the same for Mrs. SANTOS?
LUISA actually is the mother of a woman I know. So she just became a family woman, raising children and married, and yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we thank you so much. On behalf of Pacific Historic Parks Board of Directors, Management, and Staff, we'd like to thank Father Eric Forbes and all of you who registered and participated in today's History Talks. This series was made possible with funding from the Humanities Guahan and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Federal ARP Act of 2021. Thank you again and have a wonderful weekend, everyone.